The usual morning hum at Grand Central Coffee in downtown Chicago was suddenly broken by an uncomfortable pause. People who moments before were lost in their laptops or chatting over pastries went silent as an older man, his hair mostly grey, and his jacket looking like it had seen better decades, fumbled through his pockets for coins. He seemed painfully aware of every eye in the room as he searched, coming up short while the cashier waited, looking less and less patient. Just then, Mark, the manager, stepped over from behind the counter. He was known for running a tight ship, and his voice echoed across the polished tile floor, sharper than the early chill outside. "No cash, no coffee. That's our policy, sir." The words hung heavy in the air, making the old man shrink even. Smaller as a group of suited executives at a nearby table barely tried to hide their smirks. Some clients averted their eyes, but most just watched, entertained by the discomfort of someone else's bad luck. In the midst of it all, standing near the pastry display with a full tray in hand, was Sophia. She had started her morning shift just an hour ago, but this scene brought back memories she'd rather not revisit. An image flashed through her mind, her dad, years ago, asking a stranger for help during tough times. She felt anger welling up, but more than that, a genuine urge to help. Nobody noticed her at first as she stepped forward, until she spoke. "Up." "Put his coffee on my tab, please," she said, her voice much steadier than she felt inside. A hush fell over the room as all heads turned her way. She knew her tip money for the day would take a hit, but at that moment it didn't matter. What mattered was that no one deserved to be put on display for not having a few bucks to spare. Mark hesitated, maybe surprised, but finally nodded and stepped aside. The old man glanced at Sophia, an expression of quiet gratitude crossing his face. He nodded back, his dignity intact despite everything. The eyes that had judged only moments ago now watched in awkward silence. Sophia exhaled softly, knowing she might get a lecture from the manager later, but also knowing she couldn't have done anything else. For her, helping out was never about obligation. It simply came down to seeing someone else's pain and choosing, even in the smallest way, to share the load. The change in Mark's face was almost instant. His jaw tightened and a thin smile appeared, but it was the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He took Sophia's money, holding it just a second, longer than necessary, as if wanting everyone to notice how the balance of the staff had been disrupted. "Very generous, Sophia," he said, just loud enough for people nearby to hear. His tone was polite on the surface, but behind it was a clear message. "You just broke the rules here, and you better remember where you stand." The older man now had his cup of coffee in both trembling hands. He looked up at Sophia and whispered a quiet thank you, barely loud enough to make it through the buzz in the cafe. The sound of his gratitude was soft, but it carried something heavier than words. Relief, mixed with a bit of embarrassment. Others around the room shifted in their seats, some clearing their throats, others pretending to focus on their phones. Whatever sense of normalcy the cafe had before was gone. It was like a quiet agreement about how people should behave had just been shaken for everyone to see. Sophia could feel the stares burning into her back as she refilled the sugar near the old man. Instead of returning to the kitchen, she chose to hover nearby, offering him another napkin and quietly asking if he needed anything else. The small talk was almost an act of rebellion in itself. She saw something in the man's face that reminded her deeply of her grandmother. Her grandmother had once lived just a few blocks away, and even as a child, Sophia understood how people sometimes looked at her as if she did not belong, like she was an intruder, not a neighbor. In that simple act of paying for someone else's coffee, Sophia felt the weight of generations behind her, a sort of silent protest against letting people be made invisible or unwelcome. On the surface, it might have looked like just a cup of coffee, But for Sophia, it was much more. A refusal. To accept the little cruelties everybody pretended not to notice. Maybe today she would get a cold shoulder from Mark or whispers from co-workers, but none of that mattered as much as making sure one person knew he mattered, even if just for a moment. The next morning, long before the sun had a chance to warm, up Chicago's grey streets, Sophia's phone buzzed with a text from Mark. "Come to the office before your shift," it read, short and cold, making her heart thump a little faster. The memory of yesterday's scene at Grand Central Coffee was still fresh, and she could already guess this wasn't going to be a friendly chat. Mark's office sat at the back of the cafe, crammed between the supply closet and a row of metal shelves loaded with extra sugar packets and napkins. Sophia squeezed herself into the tiny space, barely having room to sit before Mark closed the door behind her with a heavy click. He wasted no time, launching into his speech about teamwork, rules, and how customers expect a certain professional consistency. He didn't so much as mention the handful of coins she'd pulled from her apron, instead focusing on how her choice had set a dangerous precedent. Midway through the conversation, Mark slid a form across the desk, a formal warning already filled out in neat blue ink. "This isn't about the money," he said, forcing a calm he didn't feel. "It's about respecting the chain of command, Sophia. You work here, you follow my lead." He held out a pen, the tension so thick she could almost taste it. Her hand shook as she took the pen. While she scribbled her name, Sophia caught Mark glancing not at her, but repeatedly toward the glassy bubble of a small security camera mounted high in the corner. His eyes darted back and forth, his jaw clenched just a little tighter every time. It was a detail easy to miss, unless you were watching for it. Sophia's nerves were stretched thin, but now a new feeling crept in. Curiosity. For all his tough talk, Mark didn't seem as invincible as he acted out on the cafe floor. Finished and shaky, Sophia handed back the signed paper. Mark offered the weakest of nods, waving her away as if he had more important things to do. As she stepped into the hallway and let the door close behind her, Sophia hugged herself to steady her nerves. But she could not stop thinking about that look in Mark's eyes, a flicker of worry or even fear hiding under a mask of control. The whole scene left her uneasy, but also strangely alert. Maybe the person who seemed to rule the shop wasn't as secure as everyone thought. After her shift ended, Sophia felt worn down in a way that went beyond just sore feet or an aching back. The day had been heavy, every moment in the cafe flavored by awkward silences and long looks in her direction from the other staff. She changed out of her uniform in the cramped break room, thoughts still tangled about Mark's strange behavior and the morning's tense meeting. As she reached for her worn-out tote bag, she noticed something sticking up from underneath her. Wallet, a plain, unmarked envelope she was sure she hadn't seen before. Her first instinct was curiosity, but it quickly mixed with unease. No name, no return address, just slightly frayed edges, like it had been folded and handled a couple times. Sophia opened it carefully, her heart thumping a little quicker. Inside was a sturdy, cream-colored card, and pressed tightly beneath it a crisp $50 bill. The card itself was simple, with neat handwriting that, for some reason, felt old-fashioned. "Thank you. The world needs more kindness like yours in it." That was all. No signature, no clue to the sender's identity. Sophia's breath caught. She knew immediately who it had to be. Still, something about the message made her shiver, a mix of gratitude and the sense that this was only the beginning of something she couldn't quite name. Walking home through slushy Chicago streets, the warmth from her jacket did little to calm her nerves. She kept replaying the old man's weary eyes as he drank the coffee she had paid for. There had been something in his face, not just relief, but a tired gratitude, as if he had been waiting a very long time for someone to simply see him. Memories of her grandmother's soft voice telling her to help when she could nudge at Sophia's heart. At home, she dropped her things beside the kitchen counter and started making soup for her mother, whose health had never really recovered after surgery a few years back. But as she chopped vegetables and listened to her mum's quiet breathing in the next room, Sophia's mind drifted again and again to that envelope. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was a gentle nudge, a reminder that even small acts could ripple out, touching stories and secrets she knew nothing about. By bedtime, she sensed life had nudged her onto a road that would reveal more about herself and the world than she ever expected. The next few days at Grand Central Coffee felt as if a silent spotlight was following Sophia everywhere she went. Mark's eyes tracked her even when he was pretending to check the pastry shelves or help a customer. Each time she punched in, he noted the exact minute. If she took too long refilling the ice bucket or wiped down the same table twice, it somehow found its way into his little black binder. He never raised his voice or embarrassed her openly, but his constant presence made her every move awkward, as if she were always on the edge of a mistake that might cost her the job. Other baristas, who once chatted with her about music or school, slowly started drifting away. Now, when Sophia tried to sit in the break room, conversations fizzled out as soon as she arrived. Some forced half smiles, others didn't bother at all. It was as if the kindness she'd shown to the old man had become something dangerous, something nobody wanted to be caught standing next to. But not everyone kept their distance. There was one friendly face that remained, Emily, who had only started working at the cafe a few weeks earlier. Emily was quick to lend a hand during the lunch rush and had a quiet confidence about her that made customers feel comfortable. One afternoon, while the two were stacking cups in the cramped kitchen nook, Emily leaned in and lowered her voice. "I saw how he's been treating you," Emily whispered, nodding toward the front of the cafe where Mark was straightening sugar containers with unnecessary force. "You know, you're not the first. He's been like this for years. My friend told me stories before I even applied here." Emily glanced over her shoulder, then scrolled on her phone to show Sophia a string of posts from a local online group. Baristas and servers had left anonymous comments for months, describing the same pattern of power trips and targeted scolding. Some talked about warnings and sudden firings, about a boss who hid his anger behind a stiff smile and company rules. The conversations had never gone public outside the group, but the number of stories was hard to ignore. As Sophia read through the posts, it became clear this wasn't just about her single act of kindness or her quiet defiance. The coldness and suspicion were just symptoms of something much deeper, a toxic climate that clung to the walls of Grand Central Coffee long before she signed her application. Understanding this, Sophia realized she was facing more than just one angry manager. She was up against a broken system people had been trying to ignore for far too long. Ordinary days at Grand Central Coffee followed a certain rhythm: regular faces, the buzz of espresso machines, people coming in on autopilot before work. But that Thursday morning, something felt off from the minute Sophia walked in. It wasn't just the aftertaste of her uneasy mornings or the weight of Mark's hovering presence. It was the way everyone fell quiet as the door opened and a new customer entered. This man stood out immediately. His suit was sharp, his shoes shined, and his posture projected assurance. But there was something else, a flicker in his blue eyes, that tugged at Sophia's memory. The regulars at the cafe snuck subtle glances while pretending to swipe at their screens or stir their coffee, and even Mark offered a rare, slightly nervous smile as he stepped forward. "Welcome to Grand Central Coffee, sir. Can I help you?" Mark sounded extra polite, a complete reversal from his usual sharpness. The man barely acknowledged Mark and instead looked around, scanning the room. "Actually," he said, his voice calm but commanding, "I'd like to be served by Sophia, if that's all right." He glanced in Sophia's direction, and every conversation in the cafe seemed to halt mid-sentence. The regular clink of dishes, Mariah's humming from the kitchen, even the traffic sounds outside, all faded into a hushed surprise. Mark tried to hide his discomfort behind a stiff grin, but Sophia could see the tense set in his shoulders as he motioned for her to take over. Her hands felt clammy as she approached the counter, heart pounding faster with every step. When the man smiled and greeted her by name, Sophia's mind spun. She was sure she had never seen him like this, confident, clear-eyed, every detail in place. But then he leaned in just slightly, and in a low voice only she could hear said, "You probably don't recognize me, but I owe you a thank you." The whole world seemed to shrink down to that moment. In a flash, she remembered the trembling hands, the worn coat, and the gratitude in the eyes of the old man from last week. Now, standing before her, transformed into someone of obvious influence, he told her quietly who he really was. The shock nearly stole her words. Before she could recover, he slid a small card across the counter, inviting her to join him for a conversation. Not here, but somewhere private, discreet. Sophia realized suddenly that her small act of kindness had rippled, outreaching much further than she had ever imagined. This was no ordinary customer. The story she thought she understood was about to change completely, pulling her into a web of connections whose scale she had never suspected. That evening after her shift, Sophia's curiosity wouldn't let her rest. The mysterious man, now revealed to be not just some ordinary customer, but someone of clear authority and purpose, had sparked questions she could not ignore. As soon as she finished helping her mom settle in for the night, Sophia opened her old laptop at the kitchen table. While soup simmered on the stove, she typed the name from the card, Henry Whitman. Results flooded the screen with stories and photos of Henry at ribbon cuttings across Chicago, speeches in front of City Hall, and gala dinners for charities Sophia had barely heard of. He was everywhere. Financial pages praised his business sense, while local news mentioned his generosity in helping rebuild libraries and start education programs on the South Side. Still, the deeper she clicked, the stranger the pattern became. Again and again, the articles described how Henry had a habit of showing up in unlikely places, quietly blending in and watching before he made some big donation or backed a new community project. In private circles, people called this process the Whitman trial. The more Sophia read, the weirder it seemed. Folks in the know feared and respected the Whitman trial. It was known to shake up workplaces, neighborhoods, and even city agencies, all because Henry wanted to study how people treated each other, especially those who seemed powerless or overlooked. According to one downtown blog, Henry believed that true character showed in small, daily moments rather than big public gestures. He was known to disguise himself, interact with cleaners or cashiers, and watch how managers handled everyday friction. His decision to help would depend on what he witnessed firsthand, not just what was written in proposals or reports. It dawned on Sophia that last week had been more than just a rough patch at work. She had been at the center of one of these hidden tests. She played back that scene with Henry disguised as the tired old man, feeling a strange mix of pride and dread. Without realizing it, she had passed a kind of secret evaluation. Now, facing the possibility of meeting with Henry alone, Sophia's anxiety only grew. This world of hidden trials and huge influence felt far beyond the usual problems of coffee shops and break-room gossip. No warning from Mark or silent treatment from her co-workers could prepare her for the new kind of power that might soon shape her life. The next morning, Sophia was bleary-eyed as she shuffled down the creaky stairs to check the mailbox outside her apartment building. Her mind was still whirring from the whirlwind of research and questions she had chased late into the night. She never expected real answers to come in the mail. Among the junk flyers and bills sat a crisp white envelope, heavier than the usual paperwork. Her name was written on the front in tidy script. No return address. Back upstairs, she slipped her keys onto the kitchen table and carefully tore the envelope open. Inside, she found a card embossed with gold lettering, inviting her to a lunch at the Drake Hotel, a place famous for its old-school elegance and historic Chicago charm. Tucked behind the invitation were a few black-and-white photographs. The pictures showed the very street corner where Grand Central Coffee stood, but it looked different. Older cars, hand-painted shop windows, and folks in outfits from another era. Across one of the photos, scrawled in looping handwriting, was a family name she half recognized, DeLuca. Her own grandmother had carried the same last name before marriage. Alongside the photos, a folded note had been slipped inside. It read, "Your grandmother was one of the kindest souls this city has seen. Her generosity changed more lives than you will ever know. There is more connecting you to this place than you realize. Sometimes doing the right thing is a family tradition. Sincerely, H.W." Sophia's hands trembled as the pieces started falling into place. She had grown up hearing snippets about her grandmother's life, stories told around the holiday dinner table about the hard years after arriving. From Italy, her habit of providing coffee and meals to lost kids and lonely neighbors. But Sophia had never connected those faded tales with Grand Central Coffee or figured her family's history would brush up against her own daily life in such an unexpected way. The reality of it all overwhelmed her for a moment. The lunch invitation. From Henry Whitman, the old family photographs, even the faded signature that looked eerily like her grandmother's handwriting, each detail felt heavy with meaning. This was larger than a simple act of kindness. Whatever conversation waited for her at the Drake was part of a much bigger story, one that reached back through her own family's history and had somehow circled back to find her now. The cafe, where she worked, the neighborhood she thought she knew, and the idea of kindness itself were all tangled together. Sophia could not help feeling that she was stepping right into a mystery almost as old as the city itself. That night, after her shift ended and she finally slipped away from the churning tension that had become her daily normal at Grand Central, "Coffee?" Sophia moved through the locker area by the back door. The narrow hallway was empty, its fluorescent lights buzzing softly. Tucked inside her locker, wedged between her jacket and bus pass, she spotted a small object, a plain black USB drive taped to a folded scrap of paper. The note read, "Watch before tomorrow's lunch." There was no signature, nothing to say who had left it, but by now Sophia recognized the silent fingerprints of something bigger at work. When she got home, she helped her mother get comfortable and then powered up her old laptop, waiting as it groaned through its slow startup routine. With careful hands, she inserted the drive and opened the first file. At first, she watched grainy black-and-white footage. There was the cafe's building, only it wasn't a cafe yet. There were crowds outside, laughter and old cars bouncing. Through puddles after rain, and a hand-painted sign that read, "DeLuca's Bakery." Blinking back surprise, Sophia saw women who resembled her grandmother, moving with purpose from kitchen to counter to sidewalk. But as she clicked further, the tone changed. Another set of files showed dated news clippings, records from the 1930s in digital scans, all pointing to a lawsuit and a family name crossed out in heavy pen. A contract flashed up, 1932. There were signatures, legal, markings and one anxious scribble on the margin that read, "Unfair, lied to us." Sophia barely noticed how her hands started to tremble. The next folder was even more recent, filled with photos and short video clips from inside the modern-day Grand Central Coffee. She recognized Mark and other staff, their faces caught in fleeting moments of bitterness, scenes showing cold shoulders, ignored greetings, sideways glances. Underneath it all were dates and notes that told a story of growing exclusion and unspoken prejudices playing out right where she worked every single day. The weight of it all pressed down on her. This was not only about the day-to-day stress, the hostile air, or even the mysterious invitation from Henry. This was about a family betrayal, a place that once belonged to her, stolen decades ago by tricks and legal loopholes, now a site of everyday cruelty. The anger that formed in her chest didn't feel like the usual sting of unfairness. It felt ancient and raw, stretching back 80 years and pulsing with the memories of a whole family's loss. Grand Central Coffee was not just her workplace anymore. It was the crossroads of everything that had been taken, and maybe everything she could now reclaim. Sophia sat quietly at the kitchen table, staring at her laptop long after the last video faded from the screen. Anger, sadness, and disbelief mixed in her chest. The story of Grand Central Coffee was now tangled up with her family's story in ways she would never have guessed. She tried to breathe slow and steady, but her mind kept running ahead, thinking about the faces in those old photos and the casual cruelty shown in the recent ones. That cafe on the corner wasn't just a job. It had become a symbol of everything her family had lost and everything still broken in the present. That's when her phone buzzed with a new message. Emily's name popped up. Sophia, urgent. Just heard there's going to be a surprise investigation at the cafe. Some big organization is sending people in to review the discrimination complaints. I think it's real this time. Mark is freaking out. Sophia reread the message twice before it fully settled in. The organization Emily mentioned was well known in Chicago for cracking down on labor abuse and discrimination. If the rumors were true, there was a real chance all the hidden stuff at Grand Central Coffee, all the things folks had been too scared or tired to report, would finally come into the open. Sophia pictured Mark pacing the hallways, rifling through paperwork he probably never thought anyone would check. He had always managed to hide behind company policy and charm when it counted, but now there was nowhere left to run. For a long time, Sophia had felt powerless, just scraping by and trying not to get noticed. The past few days had changed that. Now she could feel something new rising inside her. It wasn't just determination. It was a calm certainty that this was her moment, one she had been unknowingly shaped for by the generations that came before her. She thought about her grandmother, about kindness and strength handed down like a secret family recipe, about small good deeds that could set long-hidden things in motion. It felt like the whole city was holding its breath, waiting for a truth that had been buried for 80 years to finally come up for air. Sophia stood up and looked out her kitchen window at the city lights stretching over Chicago's rooftops. She knew there would be fear and chaos at the cafe tomorrow. But now, for the first time, she finally felt ready. The shame and silence had done enough damage. This was the beginning of the reckoning. Started by nothing more complicated than the kindness she'd offered to a stranger at a coffee counter. The Drake was busier than usual, with the steady clatter of cutlery and muted conversations echoing off polished marble. Sophia made her way through the dining room, feeling a strange mix of nerves and purpose. She was met at a private table in the corner by Henry Whitman, looking as composed as ever, and greeted warmly by two people she didn't know. They introduced themselves as Lisa Hernandez and Ronald Bishop, both lawyers who specialized in cases of historical restitution. Henry waved her into a seat. "We have a lot to discuss today. I promise we'll be clear and to the point." The conversation shifted fast from pleasantries to hard facts. Lisa opened a slim briefcase, laying out documents, photos, contracts, old letters, and legal records, all carefully tabbed and organized. Sophia watched them connect the dots. After her great-grandfather grew ill in 1932, the cafe changed hands by way of a contract her family had never fully understood or agreed to. Ronald explained how the paperwork had been pushed through while her family was distracted by medical bills and grief. "All the evidence points to fraud. Sophia," he said softly, sliding a faded deed across the table, "your family was never given a fair shot to reclaim what was theirs. The law ignored you. The city forgot." For a while, Sophia just listened, letting the weight of the years settle over her. She could see now that her family's story wasn't just another loss in the shuffle of immigrant life and city change. It was outright theft, carefully hidden under legal jargon and bureaucracy. Lisa leaned forward, her voice gentle but direct. "A big part of our work isn't just about money. What matters is restoring dignity and control to families who were shut out by prejudice and greed. There are a few options available: public, legal action to expose the injustice, private negotiation to secure some return, or even a chance to share your family's story and decide what feels just to you." For the first time, Sophia felt the old pain shift inside her, turning into something nearly hopeful. Instead of being pushed aside, she was now at the center, able to choose what came next. Henry nodded, almost as if reading her thoughts. "After all these years, the next step is yours. We'll support whatever you decide, but the city and your family deserve a real reckoning. It's your voice that matters most here." The conversation flowed easily after that, the lawyers explaining legal terms in plain English and offering resources for counseling and community support. It was a turning point, not just the end of a story, but the possible beginning of something new. And for Sophia, that realization brought a rare sense of peace. Back at Grand Central Coffee, things had spun completely out of control for Mark. The morning was already on edge, the whole team whispering about the rumors that had started flying around the night before. When the representatives from the Chicago Office for Fair Practices walked in without warning, you could almost feel the air go cold. They were polite but firm, showing badges and requesting immediate access to employee records and weeks' worth of security footage. No one was allowed to leave. Every staff member was pulled aside for private interviews. Mark tried to put on his best professional smile, but the nerves got the better of him. He rushed to the cramped office behind the kitchen to start digging through files. Most of the documents were routine, schedules, order forms, checklists. But then, nearly buried under a stack of outdated menus, he found an old folder that hadn't seen daylight in years. Inside were sepia-toned photographs, some nearly 100 years old, showing the original DeLuca family. In one, they all stood proudly in front of the cafe, dressed in their Sunday best, with smiles as wide as the sidewalk. The sight stung, mostly because Mark knew exactly who stood on the other side of the investigation now. Before he could do anything about the folder, the office phone rang. The number displayed was the legal office of Midwestern Hospitality Group, the company that technically owned Grand Central Coffee. Mark answered with a shaky, "Hello?" But it only took a moment for the person on the other end to make things crystal clear. The lawyer's voice was cool and precise, rattling off legal steps, timelines, and the cold facts. A lawsuit was being planned. There would be no chance to quietly smooth things over. It wasn't just a warning, it was the beginning of a fight that could cost Mark and the company everything. Feeling desperate, he called his uncle, Richard Carter, who was senior management in the corporation and had always bailed him out of trouble before. This time the call went differently. Richard's answer was sharp and quick, leaving no room for comfort. "You're on your own," "Mark, this is above my pay grade now. You'll need to deal with the fallout yourself." Mark was left holding the phone in the silent, cluttered office, feeling the fear set deep. All those little ways of cutting corners or looking the other way. After decades, it was all coming undone. There was no escaping what was coming. Sophia returned to Grand Central Coffee not as an employee shuffling in for another shift, but as the heartbeat of a different story. She entered through the front door, her posture steady, flanked by Henry, the two lawyers, and a small but focused crew from a local news outlet. The regulars glanced up from their coffee, sensing a different energy in the air. Conversations faded into uncertain quiet as the group settled themselves right in the middle of the dining room, setting up files and cameras. Even the clatter of spoons paused, everyone drawn to the scene unfolding. From the back of the cafe, Mark emerged, his face tight and drawn, forced smile doing nothing to cover his raw anxiety. Alongside him was Richard Carter, for once out. From behind the safety of corporate emails, trying to hold himself together for the crowd, they both did their best to seem in control. But to anyone looking closely, it was all too clear the usual authority had vanished. Sophia took a deep breath, letting her moment of fear dissolve. She stood up, placing a worn folder on the long communal table. "Thank you all for being here," she started, her voice steady and clear. It was much quieter than any rush hour, but the tension was thick, like the whole room was holding its breath. She nodded to Henry, who dimmed the lights and switched on a projector. Images flickered across the makeshift screen. First the black and white photographs of the original DeLuca family, then the legal documents from 1932, contrasts stamped, signatures rushed, words circled in anger and grief. Then came color photos and phone videos from recent days, showing exclusion and discrimination, quiet moments that added up to years of wrongs. Sophia read aloud snippets from her grandmother's old letters, memories of days when kindness was as much a part of the cafe as coffee itself. The evidence rolled on. Emails that exposed Mark's role in keeping certain people out, memos that skirted legal lines, all linking the past to the present. No one interrupted. Mark and Richard sat rigid in their chairs, unable to meet Sophia's eyes, their responses crumbling with every new piece of proof. The cafe, which had always hummed with noise, felt heavy with everything unspoken. Even the regulars were silent, weighed down by the stories and memories they might never have asked for, but could no longer deny. In that pause, the history of the place finally rose to the surface, no longer hidden in piles of paper or old prejudices, but out in the open, demanding something different. The moment the last image faded from the screen, Richard was the first to speak up. His words came out rushed and defensive, insisting the whole thing could be a setup. He claimed that anyone could fake old letters or alter black and white photos, and that files could be tampered with. Mark sat beside him, nodding desperately, but the conviction was gone from his voice. Their arguments didn't carry the weight they might have just days earlier. Before Richard could launch into a longer denial, Henry stepped forward and smoothly announced something that shifted the mood instantly. "We have guests joining us," he said, opening the cafe doors wide. It was just after noon, and now cameras rolled in, along with several reporters, their microphones ready to catch every word. The CEO of the Chicago Office for Fair Practices followed right behind, clipboard tucked under his arm. He walked with purpose, taking in every detail, every person in the room. There was no scrambling for the shadows now, every corner of Grand Central Coffee was in the spotlight. The CEO paused, just in front of Sophia and the table with its stack of evidence. He turned to address everyone, first acknowledging the deep pain wrapped up in these years of injustice. His words were measured and direct. "This company has a responsibility to face its past, to do more than just issue an apology," he said, letting his gaze linger on Richard and Mark. We will conduct a full investigation, not only into these documents, but also into how so many voices were ignored for so long. Measures will be taken, not just for Sophia's family, but for the entire community this place serves. Throughout the cafe, people listened in a silence that felt different now, a silence filled with relief, not just tension. Some regulars who had always kept to themselves looked up with cautious hope. For Mark, there was no hiding. The reality of defeat crept across his face, though somewhere underneath, a strange relief seemed to settle in. Years of pressure, secrecy, and looking the other way had finally broken open. Richard's shoulders slumped, and he stared at his hands, as if understanding for the first time just how far things had gone. For Sophia, there was no clear victory, at least not yet. But as cameras captured the first public steps toward justice, she felt years of anger lighten a bit. The truth was out at last. It could not be buried again. As news of the day's events swept through local media and social networks, Sophia stepped back into her apartment. The place felt quieter than usual, the city noise muffled by the old brick walls. She found her mother sitting in the living room, her posture relaxed in a way Sophia hadn't seen for years. On the small coffee table, the evening paper was open to a headline about Grand Central Coffee, their last name printed in bold for all to see. For once, her mother seemed at peace, her face soft rather than tight with worry. It struck Sophia that something had shifted at home. The house, long marked by whispers about what was lost and wrong, felt different, lighter, less burdened. Her mother, who had spent years avoiding the cafe's corner on walks and ducking questions about the past, looked up with gentle pride when Sophia came in. Rather than sadness, her eyes held hope. She reached out and took Sophia's hand. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, the words quiet but full of meaning. For both of them, it was as if an old chain had snapped, one that stretched back long before Sophia's own lifetime. Later that night, after her mum had gone to bed, Sophia sat alone with the television on low, letting the voices of distant reporters and community leaders wash over her. It all seemed a little unreal. Interviews replayed footage from the cafe, zoomed in on the family photos, and quoted her words about justice and memory. The whole city was talking, and even communities far from Chicago were sharing their own stories of loss and hope. Sophia realized with a kind of gentle surprise that this wasn't just about Grand Central Coffee, or about her great-grandparents, or even her mother. This was about changing the very pattern everyone thought was set in stone. She thought again about that simple act, a small kindness at the coffee counter, a willingness to step up rather than look away. Something so ordinary had sparked a wave that was, in its quiet way, resetting what people believed was possible. By choosing to take a stand instead of keeping silent, Sophia had started to heal not only her family, but something much bigger, a wound her whole community had carried for generations. She sat there for a long time, holding that change close, knowing a new story was beginning right here in her own living room. 3 months had gone by since everything at Grand Central Coffee came to light. Life had certainly not slowed down. If anything, it was busier and fuller than ever before. The old cafe had been transformed back to its original look after weeks of careful restoration. Gone were the modern signs and generic branding. Now, carved above the entrance in clean letters, stood the DeLuca family name for the first time in decades. The building's brickwork was cleaned, the windows gleamed, and historical photos hung proudly inside, telling the story of where it all began. All of that had only been possible after a long and public negotiation. The media pressure, a new investigation, had forced Midwestern Hospitality Group into a settlement, the numbers climbing well into the millions. The result was not just money, it meant a clean transfer of ownership. Sophia and her family now ran things through the newly formed DeLuca Legacy Foundation. The foundation's goal was not just to keep the cafe alive, but also to protect the stories of families like theirs, making sure what happened to the DeLucas would never be repeated in the city. On a mild Saturday morning, Sophia stood just outside the front door, her reflection caught in the clean glass panes. She took a moment to really look at herself, remembering all her old fear, how she used to walk quickly past this block, head down, hoping no one would notice her. Now, she saw someone different. There was a quiet confidence about her. The heaviness from before was gone. She felt connected, not only to her family's history, but to everyone who had been a part of this long, complicated healing. Henry was there with her, joining her on the steps. He offered her a small smile, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You've done something real here, Sophia," he said, handing her a cup. "This isn't just a legal win, it's bigger than that. You've given your family and this whole neighborhood a chance to move forward." His words brought comfort, and the two stood in silence, watching people walk in and out of the cafe, some stopping to read the plaque on the front wall, others just happy for a familiar spot to gather again. Sophia knew now that reconciliation was not a single moment. It was ongoing, carried in daily, choices in kindness offered freely, and in the courage to face the truth, no matter how many years had passed. Behind the crowd gathered for the grand reopening, a different kind of excitement buzzed quietly. Groups of teenagers from nearby neighborhoods, many of whom had never dared step inside the old cafe, waited just outside the new side entrance. They talked among themselves, towing the line, craning to catch a glimpse of the shiny new sign, not only celebrating the DeLuca family name, but also announcing the launch of the Community Skills Center next door. This initiative, dreamed up by Sophia and funded through the foundation, offered job training, resume workshops and mentorships for anyone who wanted a fresh start. For many young people growing up on the south side of Chicago, this building was now a door to possibility rather than just another business they passed on the way to somewhere else. Carla, once a regular customer who had watched the legal battle unfold with interest, was now at the helm of the day-to-day operations. She strolled between the cafe and the training rooms, making sure every detail fit the new vision. Carla wanted the old regulars to feel welcome, but also made a point to greet every new face by name. In meetings, she reminded everyone that their mission was bigger than pastries and espresso shots. It was about holding space for stories, about refusing to let anyone feel small or unseen. Meanwhile, not so far away in a much less celebrated cafe on the city's west side, Mark sat alone, with a lukewarm mug of coffee. The walls were dull, the food bland, and the staff largely kept to themselves. He wore a plain jacket, the kind that blended in, and kept his gaze down at the scratched tabletop. The seat held none of the comfort he had enjoyed at Grand Central. Coffee! Gone were the days when people deferred to him or laughed at his jokes out of obligation. Mark sipped his coffee, feeling the weight of stares from strangers who saw nothing special in him. For the first time, he got a taste of what it was like to be ignored, to be someone who could disappear in the hum of a busy weekday, his history meaning nothing. As he listened to the conversations around him, Mark realized that this was a different kind of lesson, one he could not escape with apologies or quick fixes. The city rolled onward, changed and changing, its future now shaped by hands other than his own. On the day of the grand opening, the streets around Grand Central coffee were full of energy. Balloons in the DeLuca family colors framed the newly polished entrance, and a long line stretched down the sidewalk. Neighbors, friends, former employees, and people who had only ever seen the cafe on the news. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder with folks carrying homemade signs or snapshots of family members who had been part of the story. It was more than a reopening. It felt like a coming together to mark a turning point in the community. Sophia stood by the entrance next to her mother, both of them holding the bright red scissors for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Their smiles were a mix of nerves and joy, but when the ribbons snipped and applause broke out, Sophia felt pure gratitude. She spoke into the small microphone, her voice steady. Today is about honoring everyone who fought to keep this place and its memory alive. Here, every cup of coffee we serve will celebrate the resilience that got us to this day. We are not just reopening a cafe, we are reclaiming our history. People clapped and cheered, some with tears in their eyes, as families reunited in the courtyard and children darted between the tables. In small ways, the first day showed how things had already changed. Young people from the skills center working side by side with older staff, everyone welcomed as part of the team. The scent of fresh pastries and strong coffee drifted out into the street, drawing even more people in. Later, once most of the crowd had settled in and the buzz had mellowed, Sophia spotted Henry by a window table. He was watching the new team settle into their roles, his gaze soft and thoughtful. Curious, she got herself a coffee and walked over, sliding into the seat across from him. They greeted each other quietly, the way friends do when words are not always needed. Sophia asked Henry what made him design his social experiments the way he did, testing how people reacted when there was no reward on the table, just an invitation to be themselves. He shrugged, smiled a bit and said, "True character shows when nobody's watching and there's nothing at stake. Authenticity is where real wealth lives, different from anything money or titles ever gave me." His words lingered with Sophia, even as laughter and chatter swirled all around them. She realized now that this new beginning was not just about righting old wrongs, but about making sure the cafe stayed a place where everyone could show up as themselves and belong. The week after the celebration, Grand Central Coffee took on a new role in the neighborhood. The team had worked hard to get a special exhibition ready, and now one whole wall in the main room was dedicated to telling the cafe's story. Visitors who wandered in found themselves drawn to a timeline stretching from the DeLuca family's arrival in Chicago through the early days of the cafe to that painful chapter when ownership slipped away, and finally to the moment of homecoming and restoration. Black and white photos had been blown up and framed. There was Sophia's great-grandfather, smiling in a crisp apron in front of the original counter, his pride visible even in the faded image. There were documents, clippings, and excerpts of family letters, all laid out in a way anyone could follow. For customers and casual visitors, it was more than just nostalgia or decoration. This wall brought real faces and moments into focus, making clear the years of struggle and showing that justice, although slow, was possible. School teachers started bringing their students for quick lessons in local history. Office workers on their coffee break read the captions out loud. Some people left sticky notes with memories of their own, turning the wall into an ongoing story, always growing, always being added to. As part of the agreement hammered out after all the controversy, Richard was required to attend the opening of the exhibition. He showed up dressed in his Sunday best, but nothing could cover up the discomfort on his face. The cameras and the whispers followed him, but he did not turn away. He stood quietly, hands folded, taking in every photo and every letter. Sophia saw him standing awkwardly near a timeline photo and decided it was better to approach than to pretend he was not there. She moved beside him and spoke plainly, her voice steady. "This isn't about making you feel small," she said. "It's about setting things right for everyone who was hurt." Richard met her eyes for a moment, searching for anger or triumph, but saw neither. She continued, "Justice isn't the same as revenge. Truth is not something you can just take away from someone else, no matter how hard you try. You can hide it for a while, but it always finds a way back to the surface. Her message was simple but strong, and it hung in the air between them, impossible to ignore. The story of Grand Central Coffee's return took on a life of its own, spreading across the city and even making headlines on national news outlets. Reporters reached out to Sophia for interviews, asking her about her fight for justice, her family's history, and what it meant to turn pain into purpose. People began to see her as more than just the granddaughter of a cafe founder. She was quickly recognized as a new kind of leader in Chicago, one who blended honesty with a real care for her neighbors. Her approach stood out in a world often driven by competitiveness and personal gain. Instead of chasing the spotlight, Sophia focused on lifting up others and honoring the past, which only made folks respect her more. Meanwhile, Richard's world had shrunk. The loss of his place in the business community stung, and doors that had always opened for him were now firmly shut. He sent out resumes, tried to line up meetings, but word in Chicago spreads fast. No one wanted to be linked with his name after the scandal. For the first time in his life, Richard felt the sting of being on the outside. Simple things became hard. People who used to greet him now looked away, or worse, whispered behind his back. That feeling of not belonging that he'd made others feel all those years had finally landed at his own feet. One afternoon, Richard found himself in a small coffee shop off Ashland Avenue. Nothing fancy, just plain tables and old, scratched chairs. He sat quietly, staring into his cup, wishing things could be like before. He was startled when a young barista, no more than 19, with a shy smile and tired eyes, came over and set a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. "This one's on the house," she said. "Everyone has a rough day now and then." The offer, totally unexpected and with no hint of judgment, cracked something open inside him. He wanted to refuse, to muster up some pride, but the kindness in her gesture caught him off guard. For a moment Richard was overwhelmed, and tears pricked at his eyes. He nodded his thanks, barely trusting his voice. That simple act, a free coffee given without expectation, felt heavier than all the deals he'd ever closed. It was as if, in that quiet moment, Richard finally understood how a small bit of humanity could matter far more than reputation or success. The cycle had come full circle, not with headlines or fanfare, but with one act of compassion that showed what real strength looked like.